by telling you about Daniel's story. Oh, first of all, too, I had a bit of a chuckle. If I was referred to as an expert on the brochure that was put up there, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I like to think that at the best, sometimes I'm a courageous amateur. And particularly when it comes to restorative justice, I don't think there are any experts around restorative justice. I'm going to start by telling you about Daniel. This is Daniel's story. I met Daniel in late September of 1999. That's a long time ago. And it was at a meeting of the Restorative Justice Coalition. Daniel was 24 years of age at the time. He was a drug addict, and he was serving a sentence of 10 years for aggravated assault. He almost killed one of his fellow drug dealers and friends in New Westminster, and that was at the age of 18. From age 12, Daniel was in and out of custody, and mostly in custody, youth custody. He didn't have a family, he had no support. He was living on the streets in New Westminster, doing, as you can imagine, all kinds of crime and supporting his habits, his addictions that he had. Daniel came to our meetings, our regular weekly meetings, for about 6 months, and he only talked in the opening and closing circle, and just to say hello and goodbye, and this is my name. At the Christmas meeting between Christmas and New Year's of 1999, we started out having a social night. We were going to eat food and not have a meeting, but we ate all the food, so a meeting broke out. We formed the circle. And we only had time to go around, and I remember in those days we had a lot of people because William had a much bigger population than it does today. We had probably 50 people in that circle. Daniel was sitting to my right, and I did the circle going to the left, and so Daniel was the last person to get to speak. But the question for the night was just to tell us your name and what does this group mean to you? And it went around and lots of really thoughtful responses. It got to Daniel, and Daniel started to cry. And we sat there, and finally he was able, through his tears, to blurt out that this meeting meant everything to him, and then he bolted from the room. And we were all sort of taken aback, and we sat there and wondered, oh no, what have we done? And Daniel didn't come back to our meeting for 3 weeks, but in the 4th week, he came back to the meeting, and he came up to me and he says, hey, I've got to talk. And I said, okay, we'll do the opening circle and you can talk. So he then talked, and the voice that we heard was incredible. He said that the last 3 weeks were the best 3 weeks of his life. He said the number of guys from inside here that came up and asked him, hey, man, can we help you? Is there anything we can do for you? He said that was the best thing that ever happened. He said, just them asking. What happened after that? His parole officer called me up and said, what happened to Daniel? And I said, oh, nothing. And she said, well, he's talking, and I'm going to put him up for parole. So she did. She put him up for parole, and he was granted parole in April of 2000 now, and which was great. The slight problem that Daniel had with that was he was involved in the planning of the building of the labyrinth at Christ Church Cathedral, and he was about to be released about 2 weeks before that was scheduled to happen. He made the request to stay in prison 2 weeks longer so that he could work on the labyrinth. And he did. The warden had never had that request, but responded and said, yes, you can stay longer. Building the labyrinth was a very moving experience, and I don't know how many of you are aware or have been to the labyrinth at Christ Church Cathedral, but it's on the south lawn there. It was an experience for 5 inmates who had been part of our group, and they were out there under the auspices of work release through the institution. And every day, Dean John Wright, the Dean of Columbia and the rector of the church, would come by to see how all the work was going and to talk to the people. Lots of other people came too. And I might mention that Sister Judy Morin is here, and it was her idea that led to the creation of the labyrinth. And Sister Judy is the chaplain, or one of the chaplains out at William Head Institution. So that's where that idea came from. In any event, we finished the work on a Friday, 5 days of work, and Daniel then on the Saturday was on the ferry going over to North Vancouver to reside in a halfway house. On the same ferry, it just so happened that Dean Wright was there on the ferry as well, going over to Vancouver for the day. They saw each other, they ran, they sat down together, and they talked the whole way over. Dean Wright came back and said that he then had his sermon material for Sunday. He talked about Daniel and the joy that Daniel had found in his heart and was now off to his life outside prison, starting in a halfway house. So Daniel arrived in North Vancouver, and he kept in touch with me so that I could in turn inform the coalition as to what was going on in his life. He told me right off the bat that he wasn't going to look for a job because he recognized the power in volunteers and volunteering. So he went and volunteered at a senior center in downtown Vancouver. And he was working alongside a fellow volunteer who happened to own a painting company and who offered Daniel a job. And Daniel didn't find the job, it found him. Most people, a lot of people that come out of prison, the first thing they want to do is get a job in a cell phone, and not necessarily in that order, but not Daniel. His new friend, who was not only his employer, introduced him to rock climbing and then encouraged him to seek education in what he really wanted to do. And so Daniel said, well, I want to do art restoration. So together, they found the courses that he needed to take at BCIT. He did that, and over the course of 2 years, he graduated, and now he's working in his chosen field in Vancouver. His story isn't quite finished there. There's lots more that I've left out, but this is the part that really took me aback. Daniel took it upon himself to go and meet with the chief of the police in New Westminster. He went in there and he asked to speak to him, and they asked him why, and he said, well, I want to apologize for all the grief I caused your community during the time that I lived here before I went off to jail. And from that, Daniel said, okay, what can I do? And they agreed. He would go in as a volunteer into the youth detox center. I believe it was in Burnaby, it might be, one of the communities over there. But every weekend, Daniel would go in there and just talk to the youth. And part of his talking to the youth was that he'd roll down his sleeves and he would show them all the scars that he had on his arms from mutilation and trying to kill himself. But he told them that he was no longer lonely. He now had self-worth, and he basically told his story to those people. I haven't heard from Daniel for several years now, but I bet when I do hear from him again, I'll find out that he's married and he's got some kids of his own.